after 100 years, it's still standing, and none of the countries or signatories have really contested its provisions. I would argue that the treaty is still quite important for the system and the stability of the regions that it was in. It has been interested in and dealing with, and also for the subsystem of the world, including again Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, Balkans, and where Turkey is today, Anatolia.
Welcome to the ELIAMEP podcast series. 100 years since the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, and ELIAMEP is organizing a conference with experts for an in-depth international cross-disciplinary dialogue on the treaty and its provisions, its relevance today, and its contribution to the evolution of relations between Greece and Turkey, as well as the geopolitical balance in the wider region. Today, Professor Mustafa Aydin, Professor of International Relations in the Kadir Has University, he will be in Athens to participate in the conference, and on this occasion we will have a discussion about the Treaty of Lausanne. Thank you, Professor, for this discussion.
Thank you for inviting me.
How important is the Treaty of Lausanne 1 century after it was signed? Is it a special treaty?
Yes. First of all, it was by 100 years ago. It was very important in order to arrange the borders in Near East. If you remember the history, of course, one of the biggest issues going into the First World War was the future of the Near East in general, the Ottoman territories. After the First World War and the War of Independence of Turkey, many of the borders had to be created in the region, and negotiations took place with the attendance of quite many countries, both sides of the First World War, as well as newly emerging countries, newly independent countries as well. So in that sense, the Lausanne Treaty was the final document, except a couple of issues. It created a situation and an environment, arranged the borders between independent countries, former Ottoman countries, in a sense, and that also created a system for the next 100 years to come in what we call today Middle East, Levant, and the Balkans, in fact. So in that sense, it was a quite important treaty of creating a systematic and legal document ordering the borders, independence, and the future of countries. So that was the first one. After 100 years, it's still standing, and none of the countries or signatories have really contested its provisions. I would argue that the treaty is still quite important for the system and the stability of the regions that it was in. It has been interested in and dealing with, and also for the subsystem of the world, including again Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, Balkans, and where Turkey is today, Anatolia. Apart from this, of course, the Lausanne Peace Treaty had a number of provisions arranging relationship between the countries, independent countries, post-Ottoman independent countries, but also arranging domestic aspects of some of the countries, including Turkey and Greece. And some of these issues that was dealt in the Lausanne Peace Treaty is still active, let's say, or it occasionally becomes issues between different countries. So this also shows how important the treaty was. Let me stop there and then we'll move on.
Okay, so do you believe that it is possible to amend such a historic peace agreement as the Treaty of Lausanne? Can it be revised? Should it be revised 100 years after the signing?
First of all, legally, how you can amend the treaty is already depicted within the treaty. So the way to go about, if anybody wants to amend, is there. But that's the legal aspect. Politically, I would say two issues here. One, if all the signatories agree to change an agreement, an international agreement, they can go ahead and change it. However, personally, I would argue that amending a treaty after 100 years, it's quite a difficult situation and a difficult order, because it's almost always very difficult to get the same countries to agree on something new. Remember, this kind of treaties, and Lausanne is also that kind of a treaty, that they are signed after a long warfare. And they are the war-ending treaties and reflects the realities of the time and balances of the time. So under different circumstances, where there is no such a war at the moment, where there is no victors and losers and etc., the balances between countries are different. I would suspect it's almost impossible to get them agree on revisions of different articles. And the third aspect is, personally, when I look at the treaty, I see it has created a quite delicate balance in the former Ottoman territories, and the countries became independent from the Ottoman state. So that balance has been important to keep the peace in this neighborhood. So if we start or try to change some of the clauses of the treaty, I'm afraid that that balance will be destroyed, or at least damaged. And the result will be opening up the questions that led to the Balkan Wars, First World War, and the War of Independence of Turkey. So I would not recommend the politicians or anybody else to start looking to change the treaty.
Well, Professor, are there many ways to read the treaty, depending if you are a Turk or a Greek? Because sometimes the two countries seem to disagree about the articles, the same articles of the same treaty.
Yes, I mean, you know, in the legal profession, international treaties, there are a number of ways of reading and interpreting treaties. First of all, of course, legally, as much clarity as possible is always preferable, and nobody likes differing interpretations. However, in legal jurisprudence, sometimes the countries do disagree, especially after some years, about the meaning of some articles. In this case, the usual practice is, of course, if possible, to sit down and talk and agree on a joint interpretation. If that's not possible, of course, you can go to an arbitration or a court to decide or to explain the real meaning. In that sense, sometimes what is done is the courts or arbiters usually look into the circumstances where the treaty was created in order to be explained, understand the different meanings of clauses. Or sometimes, if available, they go and read the documents prepared during the negotiations of the peace treaty. You see, when you read them, you can understand the argumentations of the sides signing the treaty, and then you might make a decision on that. But this is all, of course, theoretical and the possibilities. Regarding the Lausanne, of course, there are sometimes we see different interpretation from different countries. Naturally, I would not like to say that it's natural that we see this, but it happens. In that sense, the only way is to go forward is not to repudiate the treaty altogether, but to talk, to negotiate, or to take it to the court or arbiter to decide what its real meaning is.
Well, how is the Treaty of Lausanne perceived in Turkey? Is it being discussed either as a decisive triumph or a catastrophic blunder? And which of the two is true? I mean,
I think the truth is somewhere in between. For you, in Turkey, it depends where are you coming from in your political views. For years, the traditional Turkish statecraft described the Lausanne Peace Treaty as a triumph, as a success, because it was signed after an independence war, and also it was constructed with the Treaty of Lausanne, which was signed at the end of the First World War by the Ottoman state. So the traditional state explanation and the historical explanation of the treaty is that it reversed the clauses of the Sèvres Treaty, which divided the country actually into some occupation zones and also some influence zones, and left very small place to Turks in the middle of Anatolia. So in that sense, Lausanne was a success, and it was shown as a victory paper document, a victory earned against the invading armies of the Entente powers. However, in recent years, there is some sort of a revivalism here, especially the political forces coming from more, let's say, political Islamist perspective, or sometimes nationalist perspective, does not see this as much as a victory and criticize certain aspects of it. But their view is it's not a defeat. They don't see it as a defeat document, but they criticize certain aspects of the treaty, and especially they criticize the people who negotiated this document. And their argument is that Turkey could have done better in negotiations and maybe getting more territories or more concessions. So this is the debate. But in general, the general perception of the treaty is that it is the founding document of the Turkish state, and that's why valued and not really to be challenged too much.
Well, for you, what is the most important aspect of the Treaty of Lausanne, and where do you believe that the treaty should have been better? And I am referring also to the exchange of the populations of a Greek and Turkish population, where now many people seem to think that it was very hard, and it was something that maybe it shouldn't have been done because it was obligatory.
Look, this is a problem of today. We see this kind of historical rethinking in many countries and in many aspects. What people are doing is using today's sensibilities and today's understanding, and they are looking in the history and making historical judgments with today's understanding. I think this is not right. And it's not only about Lausanne, it's not only about Turkey and in this part of the world. This is very active, for example, in the United States and in the United Kingdom as well. I mean, we saw examples of some monuments being destroyed, and the names of the universities are being changed simply because the name for 200 years ago was involved, let's say, slavery. But this is a wrongful approach, and I think it's the same with the Lausanne Peace Treaty and exchange, the Treaty for Exchange, which is a kind of another document at the time. Because if you look at the time, early 1920s, and even before then, like the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, there were a number of exchange agreements, population exchange agreements between different countries. And if I'm not mistaken in remembering, Greece particularly had this exchange of agreements with different countries, including Bulgaria and I think Romania as well. So this was not something totally new and something totally untried. In that sense, it was the reflection of the time. Of course, it's easy to criticize it from today, arguing that it was compulsory and caused several issues, especially for the individuals who had to leave the countries. But again, we have to read and understand it in the spirit of the time, where the priority was to save lives, because they understood at the time that these minorities in different countries, in different independent countries, became subjects of discrimination. And remember, the understanding of minority rights, the understanding of human rights, etc., was only just starting at the time. And it was difficult. I think it was a very difficult choice, but nevertheless agreed. Now, looking from today, I can see the problematic aspects of it. I can see the personal problems, personal issues arise from it, and etc. What was one more aspect of the question was?
Yes, it was for you. Yeah. What is the best that the Treaty of Lausanne did, and what is the worst, or what is that it wasn't correct, or it should have been better? It could have been done better.
Yeah, I mean, answering the first one is much easier for me. It's that the most important aspect of it was creating this peaceful, balanced political environment in the wake of Ottoman Empire. When we look at the dissolution of empires in the historic periods, it's always problematic. It always creates wars and conflict and difficulties. But and also the Ottoman Empire's dissolution has not been different. Did not been different. Various wars, conflicts, uprisings, etc., took in from the mid 19th century onwards. But after the Lausanne Peace Treaty signed, for a long time there has not been a conflict between the former Ottoman countries that become from the independent from the Ottoman Empire. And it stood to the test of time, you know, even though many people argues and disputes different aspects, didn't like borders, whatever. But after 100 years, we can say that it provided peace and stability in the region that it dealt with, which is, I think, the most important aspect of it. Problematic aspects, I mean, many people find it problematic from their own different perspectives. I mean, if you are looking from a Turkish perspective, you could argue that it didn't really comply with what Turks calls the national borders. You know, when the Turkish nationalists started the struggle for independence, they prepared this national document, Misak-ı Milli, national end, in a sense. And it listed the territories that it should belong to Turkey. So some part of these territories were not recovered at the end of the war and were not recovered by the Lausanne Peace Treaty. So from the Turkish perspective, you could argue that that's a weakness and that has to be changing. Or there were other limitations on Turkey. For example, there was an attachment document about the Lausanne Straits Treaty, another agreement put limitations on the control of the straits. Or there were different aspects of economical limitations. Turkey had to pay most of the Ottoman debts, international debt, and etc. And I'm sure the other countries could come up with different sorts of complaints and argue that it was not fair and etc. But fair really doesn't play a role here. It reflects, and this kind of document reflects the balance of power of the time, and it is as much as possible getting the sides to agree. Eventually, all the countries signed it, and eventually all the countries abide with it in 100 years. I think that shows how remarkable the treaty was in creating these balances and agreement. From that understanding, I really don't give much credit to the criticism of the treaty, even though there might be some weak sides, weak aspects, which is normal in every document you can find it. On the balance, I would say that this was a very good peace treaty, and still, in today's world, it's still important to keep it as it is.
Do you think that maybe in a peace treaty of the future, we already have a war in Europe with Russia's war against Ukraine? Do you think that the Treaty of Lausanne, even 100 years after that, can set an example even for today?
Well, I mean, you can say that the spirit of the treaty preparation, what it means, what it was, what it tried to solve, and how the approach it approached the topic and issue, it could be an example. But otherwise, the topics were quite different. Obviously, the countries are different, circumstances different. So it's very difficult to take it and use it to another case in 100 years' time. But the spirit is there. The lesson is that when you have long-standing conflicts and culminating in number of wars and one world war eventually, the only way forward is to agree on something. You have to compromise for agreement. That is a message that I also keep giving when I'm talking about the contemporary issues, especially between Greece and Turkey. The only way to move forward is compromise. Every country, every nation, every side has their own rights and has their own demands. You can, in any kind of a peace treaty signed, you cannot give everything one side once and deny everything to the other side. For the peace treaties to be successful, either the two sides has to be very satisfied, or two sides has to be equally dissatisfied. I think the second. I think the second option is more realistic. You cannot get everybody fully satisfied, so you have to get them equally dissatisfied. If one side is very happy and the other, then there is something wrong, and that kind of a peace treaty do not really continue in a long period of time. So in Lausanne, having 100 years already behind tells me that there was a good balance and dissatisfaction all around.
So that's why they kept it. That's why it's so important treaty.
Yeah. I mean, the trick is to keep the signatures happy to a certain extent, but also not to give in everything that they want, because then you cannot create a balance. The most important trick is to create a balance between countries, between signatories.
Thank you, Professor Aydin. Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to welcoming you in Athens in the beginning of June, 12th of June. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This was another ELIAMEP podcast with Odin Linardatou. Recording, editing and sound editing by Petros Karpathiou. Follow us on the ELIAMEP channels on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and elsewhere.